Paris, November 885. 700 men, one bridge, 30,000 soldiers on the other side of it. Most people hear Viking siege and picture longships on fire, axes in the dark, chaos. That's not what this was. What happened on the Seine over the next 11 months was something closer to a masterclass in defensive engineering. And when it was over, the largest organized army in Western Europe had paid the attackers to leave. Not defeated them, paid them. Here's the detail that changes everything. The Norse didn't win this siege by fighting harder. They won it by building smarter. And the last layer, it has nothing to do with courage. The Carolingian Frankish Empire in 885 was not a weakened power clinging to old glory. That framing is wrong, and it matters that it's wrong. Under Charles the Fat, great-grandson of Charlemagne, the Franks commanded the largest single military force in Western Europe. Tens of thousands of trained soldiers, siege equipment, supply chains, a professional cavalry, administrative infrastructure that could sustain a prolonged campaign almost indefinitely. They had home territory, they had numbers, they had every material advantage that existed in 9th century warfare. One concrete number tells you what they were up against. The Norse force at Paris numbered somewhere around 700 men. The Frankish relief army that eventually arrived has been estimated by Odo of Saint-Germain, who was there, at 30,000. That is a ratio of roughly 40-1. The Norse held for 11 months. To understand why that was possible, you need to understand what the Franks actually needed. The Seine was the main artery into the Frankish heartland. Norse fleets had been raiding up it for decades, burning monasteries, extracting tribute, disappearing before any organized response could land. What changed in 885 was that Sigfred, leading the Norse fleet, wanted to push further upriver, past Paris into Burgundy. And standing between him and that river was a count named Odo and 2 bridges. That's the transaction from the Norse side. This wasn't about Paris. Paris was an obstacle. The silver was upriver. The bridge was simply in the way. What makes this story strange is that the Franks understood this too. They knew what the Norse wanted. They knew that granting passage upriver meant months of unchecked raiding into the agricultural core of the empire. Holding the bridge was not symbolic, it was economic. Every day the Norse stayed pinned at Paris was a day Burgundy wasn't burning. So both sides had a calculation, and both sides ran it for 11 months. There's a version of this story that runs something like this. Brave Viking warriors overwhelmed a decadent Frankish empire that had forgotten how to fight. Horned helmets, savage raids, Christian monks cowering behind stone walls. Odo of Saint-Germain wrote it down differently. Odo was a monk at the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, just outside the walls of Paris. He watched the siege from inside it. He wrote an account in Latin verse, the Bella Parisiacae Urbis, the wars of the city of Paris, that runs to over 1,200 lines. It is one of the most detailed first-hand military accounts from the entire Carolingian period. What Odo describes is not a disorganized barbarian assault against a trembling city. He describes a Norse force that arrived with engineering equipment, that built siege structures, that coordinated assaults across multiple points simultaneously, that adapted tactics when initial approaches failed. He also describes the Frankish defenders, and Odo of Paris specifically, in terms that are anything but contemptuous. Odo was a capable commander. The garrison held not because the Norse were incompetent, but because the defensive position had been built to hold. The archaeology and the written record agree on one thing. This was 2 organized forces running 2 coherent systems against each other for nearly a year. That's not the Hollywood version, but it's the one that actually happened. The answer isn't one solution, it's a system, and each layer is more deliberate than the last. Start with the bridge. Not the idea of a bridge, the specific physical structure the Parisians built and what it was designed to do. Because the bridge at Paris in 885 was not a crossing, it was a weapons system. There were two of them. A grand bridge on the north side of the Ile de la Cité and a smaller bridge to the south. Together they spanned the Seine completely. No gap, no passage, no way upriver without going through both. At each end of the grand bridge, the Parisians had constructed a tower. Stone base, wooden upper structure, built fast in the months before the Norse arrived. Each tower was manned, supplied, and connected to the bridge itself by a chain system that could be raised or lowered to control river traffic. Here's the detail that changes everything. The towers were not defensive positions built to be defended. They were choke points built to be unmovable. The distinction matters. A defensive position invites the attacker to find the weak point and press it. A choke point forces the attacker to defeat the position entirely before gaining anything at all. You cannot go around it. You cannot ignore it. You have to break it or wait. The Norse tried to break it on the first day. Abo describes the initial assault. Longships in formation approaching the bridge, Norse warriors attempting to bring the tower structure down with grappling hooks, battering equipment, and fire. The garrison held. Not comfortably. Abo is specific about casualties, but they held. The tower on the north bank took significant damage. The wooden superstructure burned in places. And then the garrison rebuilt it overnight. Think about what that means operationally. 700 men. Some of them are holding the walls. Some of them are managing the wounded. Some of them are watching the river for fire ships. And a portion of them, exhausted in the dark in November, are rebuilding the structure the Norse just spent a day trying to destroy. That is not improvisation. That is a prepared rotation system. Somebody decided in advance which men would fight and which men would build, and when they would switch, and what materials would be stored where. A garrison that size cannot sustain 11 months of siege pressure without a command structure that manages human exhaustion as deliberately as it manages the physical walls. Odo of Paris ran that structure. He understood something that most accounts of this siege underweight. The limiting resource inside the defense was not stone or timber or weapons. It was functional human attention. Men who have been awake for 30 hours make mistakes. Mistakes at a choke point cost the choke point. Odo rotated his positions. He preserved capacity. He kept men sleeping when the pressure was low so they could function when it was high. Go to any modern military doctrine on small unit defensive operations and you'll find the same principle. Rest cycles under contact. Preserved capacity as a combat multiplier. The Norse arrived at it with a garrison of 700 men roughly 11 centuries before it appeared in a field manual. That is not a coincidence. That is a system. The fireship problem came later, and it very nearly ended the defense. The Norse had a standard tool for breaking river obstacles. Load a ship with burning material, aim it at the target, release it upstream. A burning ship drifting into a wooden bridge structure in the dark is extremely difficult to stop. You can't board it. You can't redirect it easily. You have one option: intercept it before it reaches the structure or watch the bridge burn. The Norse sent fire ships at the Paris bridges more than once across the siege. Abo documents at least 2 major attempts. The garrison's answer was the chain system. Chains stretched across the river at angles upstream of the bridge towers designed to catch or deflect incoming vessels before they reached the structure. Not guaranteed, Nothing about this was guaranteed. But it changed the geometry of the problem. A burning ship drifting with the current now had to clear a chain obstacle before it reached its target. And clearing that obstacle meant slowing, deflecting, or stopping, which gave the garrison time to respond. One problem closed, another one opened, because the chain system required maintenance. In moving water, under current, chains don't stay fixed. They shift, they corrode, they snap under load. Someone had to go into the Seine in winter and keep them functional. Abo doesn't name the men who did this work. He names the commanders and the warriors. But the chains didn't maintain themselves. Supply was the second constraint the defense had to manage, and it was the one the Norse strategy was explicitly designed to attack. A siege of 11 months is not a military operation. It's an economic one. The Norse were not primarily trying to break the walls. They were trying to empty the larder, run the garrison out of food, out of arrows, out of the will to keep rotating the positions and repairing the chains, and the bridge would open without another assault. Odo understood this too. Paris sits on an island, the Île de la Cité. It has the river on both sides. Supply could come in by water if you could get boats past the Norse fleet, or by land if you could get a relief column past the Norse perimeter on the north bank. Neither was easy. Some supply got through, not enough, and not consistently. By spring of 886, the garrison was under genuine pressure from inside the walls. Not broken, but thinning. The margin was narrowing. If this is the kind of detail you come here for, a like takes a second and genuinely helps. The Norse knew the margin was narrowing too. That's the part most accounts skip. The siege is usually told from inside Paris. Odo on the walls, the garrison holding, the monks praying. Abo wrote it that way because Abo was inside Paris. But the Norse commanders were running their own calculation, and by spring of 886 it was producing a different answer than it had in November. They had been at the walls for 6 months. They had taken casualties. They had burned material. They had fed 700 men through a winter on supplies drawn from the surrounding countryside, which means they had been raiding the villages and farms around Paris to sustain themselves, which means the local agricultural base was depleting. The longer they stayed, the harder it became to stay. And the Frankish Empire had not collapsed, had not fragmented, had not stopped sending messages that a relief force was coming. The Norse adjusted. This is where the command structure becomes the layer that holds everything else together. 700 men. 11 months. Sustained pressure, rotating assaults, fire ship attempts, winter conditions, thinning supplies on both sides of the walls. The thing that most siege accounts at this scale take for granted is cohesion. The assumption that the attacking force simply stays. But 700 men are not an army. They are a coalition. Longship crews operated as semi-independent units. Each crew had its own commander, its own internal loyalty structure, its own calculation about when the enterprise stopped being profitable. If you've ever been responsible for a team running a long operation with no guaranteed outcome, watching the cost accumulate while the result stayed uncertain, you understand the pressure Sigfred was managing. Not from the walls, from inside his own fleet. The historical record shows something that tends to get buried under the military narrative. Sigfred left. Not the whole Norse force. Sigfred himself, the commander who had brought the fleet to Paris, negotiated a separate payment of 60 pounds of silver and withdrew his personal contingent before the siege ended. The remaining Norse force, under different commanders, stayed. This is not a story of unified Viking resolve. This is a story of a coalition force managing internal disagreement about the value of continued operations. Sigfred's exit was not desertion. It was a rational individual calculation that his marginal return had peaked and declining. The men who stayed made a different calculation. They believed the larger payment was still achievable if they held position. Both calculations were coherent. That's what makes this strange. What held the remaining force together through the spring and into summer of 886 was not ideology. It was the continued credibility of the payout, as long as the Frankish Empire had not broken the siege, as long as Paris had not fallen, but also as long as the Franks had not driven the Norse back to the sea. The negotiating position held. The bridge was still blocked. The threat was still real. The silver was still on the table. Some historians argue this was instinctive, that Norse commanders operated on raiding logic by default, and the extended siege was simply raiding logic applied to a fixed position. Others point to the internal command decisions. Sigfred's timed exit, the remaining commanders' coordinated continuation, the eventual negotiated departure, and call it deliberate economic strategy refined across generations of dealing with Frankish payment systems. Instinct or calculation? Raiding culture or strategic discipline? The comments are open. The relief force arrived in the autumn of 886. Charles the Fat, the Frankish emperor himself, with an army that Abbo puts at 30,000. And even discounting for the inevitable medieval chronicle inflation, the force was vastly larger than anything the Norse could field in the open. Here is what Charles did with that army. He camped on the heights above Paris. He looked at the Norse position. He opened negotiations, not assault. Negotiations. The emperor of the Carolingian Frankish Empire, commanding the largest organized military force in Western Europe on home territory with a fresh army, looked at 700 Norse holding a river crossing they had already held for 11 months, and decided that paying them was the better option. 700 pounds of silver, plus permission. Charles granted the Norse fleet permission to sail upriver into Burgundy for the winter to collect additional tribute from the regions there. Think about what that sentence means. The emperor paid the attackers, then gave them access to the territory they had originally come to raid. The defense of Paris, 11 months of it, ended with the Frankish emperor providing the Norse with exactly what they had come for. Odo of Paris was furious. The historical record is clear on this point. He had held the bridge. His garrison had bled for it, and the emperor had handed the Norse the river anyway. Odo's fury became the political foundation of his later career. He rode that fury into the Frankish kingship within 3 years, partly by positioning himself as the man who had actually defended Francia while the emperor negotiated with its attackers. Here's something that almost never appears in the popular version of this story, and it may be the most counterintuitive layer of all. Every popular account of the siege of Paris frames the outcome as a Viking victory. Norse raiders held the greatest city in Western Europe against overwhelming odds. The emperor paid. The Norse left with silver. Victory. The Norse didn't frame it that way. There is no Norse skaldic poetry celebrating the siege of Paris. No saga treatment of Sigfred as a great military commander. No oral tradition that held up the 11 months on the Seine as a feat of arms to be remembered. What the Norse had done at Paris was not, from their perspective, a military achievement. It was a commercial transaction that had taken longer than expected and cost more than projected. Here's the detail that changes everything. For the second and final time in this story, the departure from Paris was not a withdrawal. It was a planned close of position. The Norse commanders had arrived with a goal: access to the river and silver from the Frankish Empire. They achieved both. The 11 months in between were not a siege in the military sense. They were a negotiation conducted through the medium of sustained military pressure. The bridge wasn't a battlefield. It was a bargaining chip. When Charles paid, the Norse left because the transaction was complete, not because they were defeated, not because they were exhausted, though they were. Because the calculation had closed, they had extracted maximum value from the position. Continued presence meant continued cost with declining marginal return. The rational move was exit. Modern financial language has a term for this. Closing a position. You hold an asset, in this case the military threat to Paris, until the market pays what you believe it's worth. Then you sell. Then you move to the next position. The Norse arrived at that logic when, with longships and iron weapons, roughly 11 centuries before it appeared in a derivatives trading manual. That is not primitive raiding. That is elegant engineering of a different kind entirely. Step back from the details for a moment. 700 men, 2 bridge towers, a chain system in a winter river, a rotation schedule that kept exhausted men functional under sustained assault, a coalition command structure that held, mostly, for 11 months, and a departure time not to military defeat but to the moment the return on continued presence peaked and began to decline. None of it was accidental. Every layer was the product of generations of knowledge tested, refined, and paid for in lives. The bridge engineering came from men who had spent decades reading river obstacles and learning what stopped a longship and what didn't. The rotation system came from commanders who understood that human exhaustion was a resource problem like any other. Finite, manageable, fatal if ignored. The negotiation logic came from a raiding culture that had been extracting silver from Frankish payment systems for over a century, and knew exactly what the empire would pay to make a threat disappear. A modern siege operation of equivalent complexity requires a unified command structure, a dedicated logistics chain, and a communications infrastructure the Norse didn't have. Remove any one layer of what they built at Paris and the system fails. The chains fail and the fire ships reach the bridge. The rotation fails and the garrison makes mistakes at the worst moment. The coalition holds too long past the optimal exit and Charles finds his nerve. Every layer was load-bearing. What Charles the Fat built was a legend, Odo's courage, the brave defenders, the city that held. What the Norse built was a system. The Franks needed the legend because the outcome required explaining. The Norse needed no explanation. They left with the silver. If the question of how 700 men held a river crossing against an empire for 11 months, and what they actually understood about pressure, exhaustion, and the precise moment to stop, is what brought you here. Subscribing means you'll be here for the next time we open something like this. There is more underneath. There always is. The Seine is still there. The Ile de la Cité is still there. Notre Dame sits roughly where the Frankish garrison watched fire ships drift toward the chain. The river still runs the same direction, west, toward the sea, toward the open Atlantic the Norse knew better than anyone alive in 885. The next time you cross a bridge over moving water, consider this. 1,000 years ago, a man stood at the top of a wooden tower above this river in November darkness, listening for the sound of a burning ship on the current. He couldn't see it yet. He could hear the water changing, the way a hull moving through a river changes the sound downstream before it changes the light. He was cold. He had been awake too long. And he knew with the particular clarity that comes only from genuine exhaustion and genuine stakes exactly what happened to everyone inside the walls if he got this wrong. He got it right. Enough times. For 11 months. The Frankish emperor paid the men on the other side of that river 700 pounds of silver and called it peace. Odo of Paris called it betrayal and rode the anger into a crown. The Norse called it Tuesday. Power builds monuments. Adaptability builds the next position.